Okay, terrific. Chad, hey, congratulations for Nightcaller.
Wow, thank you.
I know it, these type of films is such a guilty pleasure for some unknown reason. And did you always intended to make this in the style of those sort of like those 80s horror movies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of that and, like Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace and Fulci's New York Ripper was a big inspiration. And, kind of that giallo meets, the 80s American sensibilities, I guess, is kind of how it all kind of came together.
Wow. Does that kind of explain where one of the characters like to watch a lot of those classics in his own way? Because I was watching, it was like going, I've seen some of those movies. It's just one of those things where, unless you're a real horror buff, then some of these great classics like Dementia 13. When you
Sure.
mentioned it, it's like we were talking about the black and white, not the remake or a colorized version or nothing.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. And though, a lot of those are like Dementia 13, Death Rides a Horse. I mean, all these films were in public domain. So that's another thing that helps kind of what you're going to choose. And there's lots of films that are in public domain that are great, not just like Night of the Living Dead. So it's one of those things that if you do your research and then you're like, oh, I'm a huge fan of, Death Rides a Horse, for example, and then you do a little research and find out that's in public domain. And then you're like, oh my God, let's put this in there. Let's add that to the script, help kind of shoehorn that in, seeing he's a movie buff, and it kind of helps it helps me as a writer. And then when you actually get there and put it on the screen, you're like, oh, this is perfect, this is amazing. So
Well, we could tell you're a movie buff too. So where did the original idea came from for Nightcaller? What sparked this for you?
I had just finished shooting Exorcism at 60,000 feet, and I had a really good time working with Ling and Kelli Maroney, and of course Robert Rhine and Robert Miano, and then kind of just wrote the script with the idea of them in mind in some way, shape, or form, and then it kind of blossomed from that. So, and again, the psychic element, I'm a huge fan of Night of the Demon, and they had just some great seance scene in that always kind of stuck in my head. And so I kind of just wanted to put the psychic element in there, and then it just kind of, when you're writing for a certain actor or their sensibilities, it kind of makes it a little easier to get it at first, the idea and the tone of the character and that kind of thing. And then when the script was done, there was really no interest from Robert Miano and Corpsy on the funding side. So it was kind of like, okay, they don't want to put any money into it. It just kind of went off to the side, and I sent it out and optioned it to another production company. They were going to make it. They ended up not making it, and the option ran out, and I got the film back, repitched it to these guys with Susan Priver in the lead, whereas she would also throw in a few dollars. And so that kind of got the momentum of the project going with her backing it. And then it kind of went from there with a little money from Corpsy and a little money from a couple other people. And then it's pretty soon we had a budget to make the thing, and we were off and running.
And this entire time, I thought that the psychic storyline was based on the fact that how cops use psychics to catch serial killers, and you want to turn that around on psychics.
Well, I think that idea is, always there because, I grew up at a time when the psychic hotlines were a huge thing in the 90s. You would always see these commercials late at night in between, watching The Twilight Zone or whatever movie was on TV at the time. And then these great commercials would come on of Find Your Future, discover it, call now, $1.99 a minute, and all your answers are there. And I'm just like, oh, that's a really interesting thing, even though it seems so schmaltzy and fake. At the same time, you're thinking, oh, what if one of them was real? And then the idea that what if a killer called it and was able to see, his murders being committed before he does them to know how they're going to go. And then he's like, hey, I've got a head up on my crimes or my murders and stuff. So it just kind of was born from that idea of, long and long ago, little seeds are planted that you're one day are like, hey, that would be an interesting thing. And all this time, 20, 30 years ago, was the different elements were planted in your head as a kid or whatever it might be. And then it came to life.
So how did you want to craft your serial killer, getting to the psyche? Because, you're such a movie buff, and you probably have all these things that you want your serial killer, the night caller, to actually do.
Right. Well, you don't want to be too repetitive. There were things like, from the film Maniac and all these other things that kind of, even Texas Chainsaw Massacre to a degree had these ideas that you wanted to kind of bring for a killer to have, almost a frightening, of course, but at the same time, you almost kind of want to feel sorry for him when you get a little bit into his head and how his father tormented him, and those things were kind of like, so instead of just, this faceless, nameless killer that's just butchering women for no reason, for me, I had to kind of get into his head and figure out, well, why is someone doing this? And if they're doing it, not necessarily just make it so evil, even though it is repugnant and evil and nasty, at the same time, kind of getting up, oh, okay, that's why he's doing it. I can understand his messed up childhood and these things that help, create this monster. And in a way, you're able to not only kind of not have sympathy for him, but at the same time, you're kind of, you can feel sorry for him to a degree because he became this way from the environment and the way he was raised. So, for me, it's kind of just a method to his madness. And for me to get behind that and write that character in the way I did was to figure out, well, why did this happen? Was it just because his mother name called him or his dad chopped his dick off? Whatever it would be, I had to figure it out and make it make sense for me to get behind it and kind of understand it. Instead of just some guy running through a woods chopping people up, I wanted to know why he's running through a woods to chop people up, kind of thing.
Well, I mean, that's the beauty about horror movies. We always wanted to get into that the sense of madness, but I do want to note that your film went in a different direction than standard horror movie genre, because they like to kill off, like naive teenagers and right, those young people. I don't think I saw a single young person in your film. Was that on purpose, or was that just a coincidence?
No, of course it's on purpose. I'm, the older I get, I'm kind of, unless I'm writing something specifically for a younger, character, this was kind of more written from the get-go for an older, women leads, and then the father character. So everyone was kind of, this age. And then when Steve Railsback came along as, that role, it was like, oh, this is great. So at first it was a younger killer, and that kind of fell through. And then when Railsback came on board, it was like, okay, now it shifted to an older guy and a history of, he was locked up for how many years. So it kind of, it came with the flow of things. So originally, whatever it was, my mind, the guy was originally, I think, 30 years old. That fell apart. Then it changed to Railsback age. And, so things just shifted with, the nature of how it came together. So normally, even if I write something for a young character, if money or finance falls through and then we need to rework it for an older character because she's willing to put in money, then it's like, then you go and you do it. I'm never really set on a certain thing, because roadblocks and obstacles will come up when you're making them for, this low budget and it's out of the studio realm. So it's just kind of going with the flow, and it felt right. And for me, it worked. And, if it was the other way around and they were all young actors and that's the way it happened, then I would, bend to that direction. But I really never have a set thing in place, especially for things that it's like, well, hey, she's willing to put in $50,000. Okay, we're going to change it. She's 80 years old now, or 60 or 50 or 15 or whatever it might be, if that means getting the film off the ground. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there in the closet and it's like, wow, I wrote a script. Great. So there's different obstacles to overcome to get it made. And one of those was an actor that was not, A, good, B, had some money to invest, and C, was not a pain in the ass. And Susan fit all those things, and she turned out great. So intentionally, the age was kind of open originally, just for, Ling and Kelli Maroney. So their age was kind of the template of it but at any time I was willing to shift that if it meant getting the film made. So.
Well, then tell us about working with Susan, how she evolved into this perfect casting, for the film, to play Clementine.
Sure. Well, I think, the first thing is someone that they read the script and they like the script and they're like, hey, this is something I can get behind, and there's an excitement there. And whether you agree on each and every line or that needs to be worked out, that's fine, as long as that base of, hey, I really like this project and the character. And with some projects, I'm willing to completely bend and rework it so everyone's happy and it fits. And in other ones, not so much. Like The Pig Killer, the film I just did, I loved the script as is. There were a few notes that I took, but other things I was kind of like, no, that's going to stay as it is. But with Nightcaller, it was just more of kind of really open to only, her suggestions, as well as Robert Miano and other, actors and producers, of getting it where it felt right for everybody. Because on the page, it's one thing, but then when you get there and you're actually watching them say it, it's kind of like, that doesn't work, and you're able to tweak it a little bit here and there. And Nightcaller, it had a few tweaks here and there, but for the most part, what was on the page really kind of worked. And Susan liked it enough at first, and then had a few notes, and I, tweaked it and whatever, and then we all kind of got there. She'd say it one way and it sounded great, and then I'd say, well, add that from the script and let's see how it goes. So it's kind of giving and taking. If an actor really wants it one way, then you say, go ahead and go for it, but also give it to me the way it's written, or the way that, we rehearse it and improvise something that might work better. And she was totally open for that. And she, was a pleasure to work with. Like, pretty much everyone on it was great.
Well, the end product speaks for itself.
I hope so.
Now, in this decade or this century, practical effects, it's almost a lost art, because everybody loves, CGI now these days. Well, we could ask James Cameron at the end of this year, but but you stuck with the practical effects. Talk about doing, something like that, because I don't know, to me that seems more realistic and gory.
Oh, I agree, and it's one of those things especially when you find a good makeup artist like Joe Castro, who's not only does a fantastic job, is just a real pleasure to have on set and to work with. And it's one of those things that you get excited because you want to see what he comes up with and how he pulls it off. And it's a hard thing to find, not only a makeup artist that can pull it off, but is also not a pain in the ass. And Joe hit the nail on the head with the effects and was great to work with. And it's also, the time he has to do it. And, you're shooting, 95-page script in 10 days. So it's, almost, 9 to 10 pages a day of trying to get this stuff done. And then usually the last, couple hours is like, okay, here's the big effects scene. Get in there, Joe, and hurry it up. And it's got to be good. And we got 3 takes. And which is fun and hard, and at the same time makes you kind of think out of the box of what works and what doesn't work. And 9 times out of 10 his stuff worked great on the first or second take, and it was like in and out of there, and it was just a joy. Whereas other films I've worked on, the effects can be one of the most arduous tasks of pulling them off, and then they don't work, and you have to cut it, and then you're pulling your hair out. But Joe is great, and it's one of those things of knowing kind of what you want to get and what you can get, and that it doesn't look fake and it doesn't look cheap, and at the same time makes you cringe. And I can't say enough about Joe doing that, because for me, practical effects are the only way to go. I'm not a CG fan at all, and unless they're just enhancing little things here and there, then it's fine. But usually if it's a full effect, whether it's makeup or face prosthetic or blood and guts, practical's the way to go.
So as a director like yourself, you would never consider CG, even though it's, because I've talked to other directors, they said CG is the way to go because on an indie budget, it's much cheaper.
No, not at all. Not for me. I think it looks like shit. And I even on big movies where it's like, that doesn't look as it kind of pulls me out of it. You know, it's one thing if it's a Ray Harryhausen, you know, the stop motion stuff where I love that. And the CG stuff on bigger stuff, Marvel stuff, I guess that works to a degree, though I really kind of like the hands-on feel of, you know, something, not a complete computer generated monster or whatever it be. If it's just, you know, as practical as can be, and then smoothing out the rough stuff with CG is fine for me, but not full CG stuff. And I guess if on a lower budget, if they're the ones, the director or whatever, have the connections for someone doing that stuff, then maybe it could be cheaper, but I don't know how, unless, because if you're farming the CG stuff out, that's usually pretty expensive, probably more so than, you know, practical stuff on set. And it's always better for the actor to actually be doing it or seeing it than just, you know, something that you have to, you know, put in afterwards. And I'm always about, you know, the here and the now and getting it done fast. It's like, I write fast, I shoot fast, and I cut fast because I will lose the excitement and the momentum the longer it takes. So it's like if we did a whole bunch of CG stuff and they're just finishing it up now, I'd be kind of like, I'm done. I'm on to another movie, you know. And it's not to take anything away from the film that I just did or the film that I'm working on now or the one that's in the future. It's just, for me, it's just kind of like I lose the longer it takes and the more it is, for me, I just kind of lose the enthusiasm for it. And, you know, I can't lie about that. It's, you know, I can totally understand Orson Welles having, you know, numerous projects, and then he would go on to something else and they're still re-editing and they'd recut it and they'd mess it up. And they were always like, well, where's he? Why isn't he finishing this? Because there's a point where you're just like, you switch off gears and you're on to something else. It's hard to go back and back. That's why when someone takes years and years to finish a film, God bless them if that's their, you know, way of doing it. But for me, it's not. I have to move on to other things. And for me, CG is a slower process that I'm really not keen on.
Well,
but never say never. I mean, there could be something where, you know, I never know. Maybe the investor is like, hey, we've got this thing. It's got all these CG monsters. We've got to have it if you want this $1 million. I love CG. Let's do it.
That's true. You can't just completely say no to it. But in this film, the one thing I noticed is all the vintage stuff. You had the vintage cars. You even had looked like a brick, you know, one of those Nokia brick phones back then, and even a Betamax machine. Where do you find this stuff? I don't even know if I could find this stuff today.
The Betamax stuff and all the tapes and all the films and all the posters, the rotary dialed phones, those are all mine. And the car was, I'm a huge classic car nut. I've had them my whole life, different cars. And the insurance that I've had on numerous cars is a company called Haggerty. And they also had started a new thing called like ride share or drive you share, where you're able to rent classic cars from the owners, and either for a wedding or you know, a date or whatever it is. And, you know, I just went on that and found the cheapest one I could that looked cool and was kind of 50s. And it was like, okay, he's $130 a day or whatever it was, and let's rent it. And it worked out great. So it kind of just, you know, thinking outside the box, where most people will be like, okay, we need a classic car. And, you know, they call up a studio car rental place, it's $500 a day or whatever. But it was just kind of figuring out something that would work not only for the car, and the guy that owned the car came out, he handled the car, drove the car, did all this stuff, and he was just fantastic. And then the police car is owned by the producer, Robert Rhine. That's his personal car. So it was kind of, you know, someone will tell you, hey, I've got this. And you're like, thinking in the back of your head, they've got this great car. So I wrote the police car into the script, and it was one of those things of, you know, a special effect in a sense, or you know, something big like that. You just kind of work it into the script where you can, and it kind of gives it a little more production value than you might not necessarily need, but you've got access to it, so you might as well use it.
Hey, you know what? It brings out the uniqueness of this film. So.
Yeah, no, totally.
Well, Chad, let me wrap it up with one more question. What's you're such a busy guy because you move from project to project. But so what's coming up next after Nightcaller?
Next is Pig Killer, which we just finished shooting and I finished editing it. Now it's in post sound and color correction and stuff. And it's about the Canadian serial killer, Robert Willie Picton, who killed like 50 women in Vancouver, Canada, and fed them to his pigs.
Oh, wow.
Time to call the publicist for that one.
No, but we've got Jake Busey in it, and it's fantastic. It's my favorite film that I've done, and it should make a splash.
Oh, wow. You know what? That I'm going to have to put that one on my list too. So that'll
Please do.
Well, Chad, it's a pleasure speaking to you, and hopefully we get to do this again, especially with that pig killer there.
Anytime, let's do it.